I'm Alex Turner, and the title of my talk today is Atmospheric Methane, Where Did You Come From, Where Did You Go? This is really one of my favorite topics. There's been a flurry of work over the past few years with a number of competing hypotheses for some of the observed trends in atmospheric methane, with explanations including things like livestock and fossil fuels. So I've always liked this image because it encapsulates some of the sources that drive variations in atmospheric methane. But before I jump into methane, I wanted to take a moment to say thank you. It's an honor to receive this award, and I've been really fortunate to work with so many brilliant mentors over the years, and to be part of such a supportive community of atmospheric scientists. It's been truly rewarding to be able to work on a small piece of a bigger societal problem. I also wanted to give a quick pitch for some of my talks and other sessions on my CO2 and SIF work. I'd be happy to share recordings of these if anyone's interested. Alright, so on to atmospheric methane. The sources of atmospheric methane are split roughly 50% coming from natural and 50% anthropogenic. A few of the big players are things like wetlands, which are the largest single source of methane, and major anthropogenic sources include fossil fuels, landfills, and livestock. The sources can be further classified based on their carbon isotopic composition, with biogenic methane being emitted from methanogens in anaerobic environments, such as wetlands, landfills, and livestock. Pyrogenic methane is from incomplete combustion processes, such as biomass burning and fossil fuels, while thermogenic methane is formed over millions of years and vented to the atmosphere through fossil fuel leaks and geologic seeps, so both natural and anthropogenic. Biogenic sources tend to be isotopically lighter or more depleted in carbon-13, and pyrogenic sources are heavier, with thermogenic sources somewhere in the middle. The sinks are a little bit easier, with oxidation via OH accounting for more than 90% of the primary sink for atmospheric methane, or as my PhD advisor liked to call it, the Pac-Man of the atmosphere, because it just goes around abstracting hydrogens everywhere. Jokes aside, though, the sink part is deceptively complicated, and this is because direct measurements of OH are neither sufficiently precise nor dense for actually assessing trends in atmospheric methane. So what I'm showing here is the atmospheric record of methane at Mauna Loa from 1983 through 2015, and I'm highlighting this time period because 2016 ended up being a pretty fascinating time to study methane, as I'll show in a few slides. So this atmospheric record has previously been broken into a few distinct periods. There was a slowdown in the growth rate of methane in the 90s, then concentration stabilized around 2000, and then began rising again in 2007. We can actually do a fairly reasonable job of representing this time series of atmospheric methane using a steady state analysis like you might do in an undergrad course in atmospheric chemistry. We need to make two assumptions. First, that the emissions are constant at 550 teragrams per year, and the methane lifetime is a constant at 9.4 years. The first term in this expression that I put here is the steady state concentration, while the second term is the transient piece. And as you can see, this blue line does a pretty good job of approximating the methane concentrations from the 1980s through about 2007. If we then apply a step change of 20 teragrams per year to the methane emissions, we reproduce pretty much the whole methane record. What I think is quite important here is that this step change in emissions represents about a 3% change in the sources. So basically what this means is that we need about a 3% change in the sources or sinks of atmospheric methane to explain these trends that we observed over the past few decades. With that as the background, 2016 ended up being a pretty exciting year if you worked on atmospheric methane. There was a flurry of work on the subject, and actually The Economist of all places wrote a piece on this scientific debate on atmospheric methane. We were actually also invited to write a perspective piece on the topic, and I'll show a summary figure from that work on the left. So the top panel of this figure shows the northern and southern hemispheric average methane concentrations. And in 2016, there were a ton of papers that came out, all trying to explain what was driving these trends in atmospheric methane. I've listed about 12 of them here chronologically, and you've really got the whole alphabet soup of journals: Science, Nature, PNAS, Nature Geoscience, GRL, ACP, JGR, ERL, and GBC. Many of these papers ended up with actually seemingly contradictory conclusions, often being published just days apart. So most of these papers used measurements of atmospheric methane, and you can actually sort of break down the conclusions that were found based on the types of measurements they used. So as I've mentioned, most used atmospheric methane, some used measurements of ethane, some used carbon isotopes, and one actually used methylchloroform. Generally, the papers that used measurements of atmospheric ethane found that northern hemispheric concentrations of ethane began to rise at the same time as methane. However, the southern hemisphere continued a downward trend. Now, this is fascinating because the lifetime of atmospheric ethane is only a couple of months, so a signal in the northern hemisphere would not have time to mix to the southern hemisphere. This implies that something in the northern hemisphere emitting both methane and ethane may be driving the trend, and fossil fuels are a source that fits this bill. However, less than a month later, a pair of papers from Eric Cort and Jeff Peischel came out using aircraft data from the Bakken in North Dakota. And what I'm showing here is a night lights image of the United States, and this blob that I've pointed out is the Bakken Formation in North Dakota. And all of that light is non-conventional oil and gas activity. I find this image pretty striking because the region is roughly the size of Atlanta, and it's entirely due to the fracking boom in the United States. In any case, what those papers found was that the Bakken alone could actually explain much of the ethane trend in the northern hemisphere. However, the Bakken is primarily an oil development with wet gas, and there's relatively little methane actually being emitted. So this means that relationship between ethane and fossil fuel methane may have actually been weaker than previous work thought. There were also a handful of papers that used carbon isotopes, or delta-13C. They tended to argue that methane trends were being driven by wetlands or livestock. And this is because the atmospheric record of delta-13C began getting lighter starting around 2008, as you can see in the panel on the left. However, there were a handful of papers using these same measurements that found that fossil fuels could also explain this trend, while others argued that source signatures for fossil fuels were poorly sampled, and we've been assuming the values for fossil fuels that were too heavy. Also, it's important to note that all the papers I've mentioned thus far have assumed the methane sink, hydroxyl, was constant. And they often cite this excellent paper from Steve Monska to justify that assumption. The paper was titled Small Interannual Variability of Global Atmospheric Hydroxyl. And this is one of the figures from that paper. Interestingly, the variability they report goes from about -5 to +5%. And so this variability is fairly small if you're an atmospheric chemist, but it's actually quite large in the context of the methane budget. If you recall earlier, we needed about a 3% change in the sources or the sinks to explain methane trends. And this appears to be quite a bit larger than 3%. So then we ended up publishing a paper in early 2017 that used measurements of methane, carbon isotopes, and methylchloroform to constrain the methane budget. And we found a positive OH anomaly that seemed to explain a lot of that methane stabilization. And actually, 2017 ended up being pretty exciting for atmospheric methane as well, because Matt Rigby published a paper in the same issue of PNAS that found a rather similar result, shown as the blue line here. And we can also overlay the data from Steve Monska's 2011 paper onto this time series. There are definitely some differences, but overall the methylchloroform data seem to be implying changes in OH that are coincident with the stabilization in the atmospheric methane record, as you can see in the pink, blue, and green lines there. Now, one important caveat is that these three papers are all using similar data sets, and this is because there aren't exactly that many long-term records of methylchloroform, so they should not be viewed as entirely independent. Nevertheless, a major takeaway from this is that OH is likely playing a role in the observed trends in atmospheric methane. However, a remaining criticism of the work is that it wasn't exactly clear why OH might have changed. And this brings me to the paper that I was going to discuss for the rest of the talk. It's something I worked on in my postdoc with Inez Fung and Ron Cohen, and the question we aimed to address was admittedly easier, but we were trying to identify feedbacks in OH concentrations and quantify the natural variability in OH. So look at what are the processes that are governing that natural variability, and are there any major feedbacks that we observe? All right, so up until this point, I've really only talked about OH in an abstract sense. So what actually controls OH? Well, there's some excellent work from Lee Murray who compared OH levels in the last glacial maximum to present day. And what they found was that OH scaled linearly with the ozone photolysis rate and specific humidity, shown yellow and purple here. And this is because OH is produced from the photolysis of ozone in the presence of water vapor. So increasing JO3 or humidity lead to increased OH. OH decreases with more hydrocarbon emissions, and this is simply because OH is the main oxidant for things like carbon monoxide and methane. So more methane means less OH. And finally, OH levels increase with more NOx emissions, and this is because increases in NOx lead to faster conversion of peroxy radicals to OH. So these are some of the general processes that might influence OH levels. All right. So the way that we actually addressed this question was by looking at pre-industrial equilibrium simulation from the GFDL CM3 model. This particular model is a land-ocean atmosphere model with 97 chemical species, and what's particularly important here is that there's no external forcing. So greenhouse gases and solar forcing are held at 1860 conditions. And this is going to allow us to get a long record of OH concentrations and really assess that variability that I mentioned earlier. And so this animation here is showing data from around the year 4000, and it's going through monthly average concentrations. And you can see the seasonal cycle in OH there. Also, I should mention that this model and the output was generated by Larry Horowitz and Vaishali Naik at GFDL. They were really gracious to share this data with me. So we used this model to generate a 6,000-year record of OH anomalies with no external forcing. And for reference, this actually took 6 years to run to simulate those 6,000 years with the GFDL model. So it's a long record, and it took a long time to generate. I'm going to focus on the first part of the record for a moment, and there was a feature that immediately jumped out when I plotted this up, and that's the jump in OH in year 1077. I was fascinated by this and began to plot up other species, and was looking for why there was this there might have been this abrupt transition. I thought it might have been sort of a shift to a new chemical regime or equilibrium state or something, and so I was pretty excited by this. I actually emailed Vaishali Naik and Larry Horowitz asking if there was anything special about 1077 at the model, and at first they said no, it should be just a continuous record, and so we began talking about why there might have been some sort of transition. But actually then Larry is the one that mentioned that he had to run the model on 3 different clusters because it took 6 different years. And so if you plot up the same time series and color it based on the different computer architectures, this is what happens. It turns out the year 1077 is when they switched from running the model on the SGI Altix machine to a Cray at Oak Ridge. So the change in computer architecture resulted in a non-trivial shift in the chemistry and consequently a 3 to 5% shift in global mean OH. It also resulted in changes in temperature and specific humidity. So overall, this highlights some of the sensitivity of the chemical system to small perturbations. All right, stepping back, I decided to focus on the last 3,000 years of the simulation because this was all run on a single machine, and I'm not really interested in looking at differences due to computer architecture. And as a reminder, what I'm trying to assess is what is the variability and what are the feedbacks in the absence of external forcing. So the first thing we did was plot up the distribution of OH changes over a decade. We're seeing about a 4% change in OH over randomly sampled 10-year periods within our record. However, that could simply be due to white noise. So the next thing we looked at was we looked for autocorrelation in the data, or memory in the system. And that is to say, is the OH value at time t randomly distributed about some mean value, or does that value depend on the previous time step? Is there some memory in that system? And these two expressions here show what a white noise time series would look like and an autocorrelated time series. And so this panel here shows the partial autocorrelation in the OH anomalies. So black dots indicate significant lags at an alpha of 0.001. So there is indeed some significant memory in this system, extending out nearly a decade, with the strongest lags on sort of sub 5-year timescales. So again, this does imply there's some memory in these OH anomalies. So we can also look at a wavelet power spectrum of the OH variability. And this is essentially showing how strong the periodicity is at different points in the record. And if we integrate in time, we see that the periodicity is strongest at about 2 to 3 years. So the orange line peaks at about a 2 to 3 year period. And we can also look at how the average variance changes over the course of the simulation. And I find this bottom panel here, particularly striking because it actually highlights that there are some highly variable times in the record, such as around year 5000, and some rather quiescent periods in the record. And as a reminder, this modulation of OH variability is all intrinsically generated. That is to say, it's not simply driven by a change in emissions. And it also highlights just how short our observational record is. We could have easily observed a quiescent part of the atmospheric record with our present-day sets of measurements, whereas there might be a more variable baseline that's actually more representative. All right, so all this begs 2 questions. What's driving these feedbacks, and really where is this memory coming from? All right, just as a reminder, we're seeing a strong periodicity at 2 to 3 years, and as some of you may have already guessed, this is pretty similar to El Nino. So what I'm showing on the right is the same power spectrum, however done for the Nino 3.4 region in the tropical Pacific. And you'll notice that both have a periodicity that peaks around 2 to 3 years. So this is some tenuous evidence that ENSO is at least related to this OH variability. What we can also look at are the spatial patterns. So this figure is showing a climatology of the OH concentrations, and we can see the largest values in the tropics where most of the OH production occurs. And this panel on the bottom shows the OH variability that is not associated with the seasonal cycle. So there is a seasonal cycle in the fire emissions from CO, but they're constant over time. And what we're already seeing is some rather interesting features. For example, there's a band of variability across the Pacific that is quite large given the relatively low OH concentrations there. So what we did was we did an EOF analysis of those OH anomalies from the model. And this figure on the left is the leading EOF that shows a fairly striking resemblance to ENSO, with a feature extending out into the Pacific and a dipole feature in the Western Pacific. And then finally, what I'm showing in the bottom is the time series of the Nino 3.4 SST anomalies and the first principal component from that EOF analysis in black. And I think this is the most compelling evidence by looking at how the principal component relates to those Nino 3.4 SST anomalies. So we're seeing a strong anti-correlation between the two with an R value of minus 0.84. And overall, I find this to be fairly compelling evidence that ENSO is the dominant driver of this OH variability that we're seeing in the absence of forcing by emissions. So this again still begs the question, how would ENSO actually modulate OH? Well, returning to earlier, these are some of the factors that control OH. Things like ozone photolysis, specific humidity, the sources of NOx, and the sources of CO and hydrocarbons. So there are a few possible mechanisms that could explain what we're observing. ENSO could change the Walker circulation, for example, which would impact stratospheric ozone and in turn OH. ENSO could change temperature and humidity via Clausius-Clapeyron. Or ENSO could affect convection, which would affect the NOx emissions via lightning. Or ENSO could change the sources of carbon via biomass burning or wetlands. The last one's probably not the case here because the emissions are being held constant in our simulation, aside from the seasonal cycle. And it turns out that the third one is actually the primary mechanism that drives what we observe in the GFDL model. And that's ENSO-induced changes in simulated lightning NOx are driving the OH variability. So this can be seen in the figure below where which is similar to one I showed earlier, but I've now also overlaid the NOx emission anomalies in green. So you can see the NOx emission anomalies in green track PC1 almost perfectly. And the reason for this is because the GFDL model has, as most models have, lightning emissions of NOx are tied to cloud top height. So increases in convection and cloud top height result in more NOx emissions and consequently, in our case, more OH. So again, it seems like ENSO is really the driving factor in this OH variability. However, in the GFDL model, that's occurring primarily through variations in convection and consequently lightning NOx. So we see the strongest cases in periods of La Nina where we see big increases in lightning NOx. All right, so is there evidence of this actually happening in reality, or is this simply a model construct? Well, what we looked at was the flash count data in the tropical Western Pacific and found that it was anti-correlated with ENSO. So La Nina is associated with an increase in lightning in the tropical Pacific. And actually other work has also seen this. For example, this paper found an increase in maritime lightning during La Nina compared to El Nino. So both the La Nina periods we looked at were consistently higher than El Nino. Finally, bringing it back together, we do see variations in the methane growth rate that seem to coincide with periods of La Nina, such as the onset of the stabilization. And this panel I'm showing here shows the Nino 3.4 SST anomalies with the methane record overlaid on top of that. And you can see right around the 2000s when the stabilization began, there was an extended period of La Nina. However, ENSO and OH are clearly not the whole story. ENSO will affect many aspects of the Earth system, such as wetlands and fires. So there's quite a bit of work to be done assessing the relative role of things like wetlands, fires, and OH. Overall, it seems likely that OH is playing a role in these ongoing methane trends, and I continue to be fascinated by these interactions between the carbon cycle, atmospheric chemistry, and climate dynamics. And with that, I wanted to say thanks, and I'll take any questions or comments you might have.